Last Sunday, we began a new series. The whole of this year, we're going to be focusing on good news. And last Sunday, we began a series called It's a Time to Build. It's a Time to Build. And we're going to be looking at what Jesus says over the next few weeks about building and about builders. So last week, we started with the wise and foolish builders, which is a well-known story in Matthew chapter 7. And we learned that if you're going to build anything, you need to make sure your foundations are okay. But really, Jesus was talking about our lives. If you want your lives to be worthy of God and to be useful to God and to make a difference in the world, then you need to make sure your foundations are good. So this week we look at another story that Jesus told. It's a story of a rich man who built bigger barns. Built bigger barns. I like the sound of that. Built bigger. It sort of rolls off the tongue. But anyway, it's really about the values that need to be underpinning our lives. And Sarah Heaney is going to read the story for us, and the passage it contains it on Zoom. So you need to unmute yourself, Sarah, and over to you.
Morning, everyone. This morning's reading is from Luke chapter 12, verses 13 to 21. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Who appointed me as a judge or an arbiter between you?" And he said to them, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." And he told them this parable. A certain rich man produced a good crop. "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." "I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grains and goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded of you. Get what you have prepared for yourself. This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich towards God." May God add his blessing to this reading of the Holy Word.
Thank you, Sarah. So there we have quite a challenging passage. Quite a challenging passage from Luke chapter 12. It raises all sorts of questions. It raises questions like, does Jesus care about injustice? Because here's a man who feels he's been treated unjustly and Jesus doesn't seem to help him at all. It raises questions about, is it wrong to have savings? How are we supposed to balance the need for personal financial security with the needs of others? So these are big questions, and they're all raised in this parable that Jesus told. But let's look at what happens. So there's Jesus. He's almost at the height of his popularity. He's surrounded by crowds. They all love to come hear him speak, and they love the miracles he does. So all these crowds, and in the middle of these crowds, he's actually trying to give instruction to his disciples, the people who have actually chosen to follow him, the people who are following him seriously. So in the whole of Luke chapter 12, if you look at the verses before what we read today, you'll see that that's what he's doing. He's trying to sort of teach his disciples the things, the values that really matter. And then he's interrupted. There's a man who says, "Teacher," someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Now, on the surface that sounds like a reasonable request to make. We know that in those days, Jewish rabbis were often approached to give sort of advice on points of law. And the Jewish inheritance laws were particularly vague in certain areas. So that it seems a fairly standard thing for someone to come to Jesus, who was thought of as a rabbi, a teacher, a religious teacher, and to ask him to sort of sort it out for him. But if we actually dig a little deeper and actually look at what happens that day, we begin to realize it's not quite as straightforward as all that. If you want a rabbi to make a ruling, then it's usual for both parties to go to the rabbi and say, well, this is my side of it, and this is my side of it. What do you think is the right thing to do? But in this passage, there's absolutely no sign of the other party. There's just one man there. His brother doesn't seem to be there at all. So we begin to think, hang on, he's not wanting Jesus to give a fair and just ruling about a matter of inheritance law. He just wants Jesus to take his side so that he can get his share of the inheritance. And Jesus' reply is very blunt. Man, he says, who appointed me as a judge or an arbiter between you? In other words, listen, my calling is not to sort out your financial matters for you. This is not why I have come. And then he goes on to warn people to guard against all kinds of greed. And to say that life is not just about material possessions. And then to emphasize it all, he tells a story. And it's a story about a man who wanted to build bigger barns. When you think about the story, again, on the surface, building bigger barns seems a reasonable thing to do. You've got all this surplus grain. You need to put it somewhere safe. You need to make sure it's stored properly. Otherwise, it's going to go to waste. So clearly this man was just being prudent with the use of all this wealth that was there, all these resources that he had, and he was thinking about the future. I mean, don't we all think about the future? So what's wrong with that? Again, it's when we dig a little deeper that we begin to uncover what his true motives were and the values that underpinned them. Because what we need to do is ask, why? Why did this man need to build bigger barns? He clearly already had barns. We're told he was a rich man. See, he has barns. He just wants to build bigger barns. I'm wondering how often I can get away with saying that phrase. Surely the barns he already had were big enough to store all the grain he needed for himself and more besides. You know, in those days, the only reason you would need to build bigger barns would be so that you could hoard grain. Grain hoarders, there were grain hoarders about. There used to be grain hoarders about in our country too, at a time when people were very dependent on the harvest. Grain hoarders were farmers who turned the riches harvested in a year of plenty into a source of profit in the years when the rains didn't come. The rains failed. What did you do if you didn't have lots of reserves? Well, you started to use up your seed grain, the grain that you would use to plant your next crop. If you've run out of the grain that you've harvested and all you've got left is the seed crop, well, you have to start eating that, otherwise you're going to starve. Otherwise your wife and your family are going to starve. Your kids, your loved ones are going to starve. And once you've run out, then you need to still get grain. So who do you go to? You go to someone who has hoarded it. And the person who's hoarded it can ask any price, because they know that you've got no choice, because otherwise you're going to starve. And the quality of the grain by then wouldn't have been brilliant, because it had been stored for years for a rainy day. But you still know, if you're a grain hoarder, that people will come and they'll pay any price for this poor quality grain, because they don't have any choice. And they might even get themselves heavily into debt to do it. But still they don't have any choice, because otherwise they're going to starve. And you don't care. So the people listening to this story would know exactly who this man was that Jesus was talking about, who wanted to build bigger barns. This wasn't good stewardship. This was selfishness and greed and a desire to exploit the needs of others. Simple as that. But if we dig even deeper into this story, we uncover a fundamental flaw in this rich farmer's thinking. If you ask any farmer, they will tell you that every harvest that is reaped is a gift from God. It doesn't just happen. God provides the seed, God provides the rain, God provides the sunshine that grows and then dries the crop ready for harvest. This man's bumper harvest was evidence of God's generosity towards him. It wasn't evidence of his cleverness. It was evidence of God's generosity towards him. But here's a man who seems to think that it's all his by right, to do with as he wishes and for his own benefit. He already has more than enough to meet his own needs. But he has no thought of sharing the surplus. Rather, he's going to build bigger barns. And Jesus ends up with these chilling words. God said to the man, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich towards God." Not rich towards God. Let's go back to those questions that we posed at the beginning, that we felt that this passage raises for us. See if we can come up with some answers. First question was, does Jesus care about injustice? Does Jesus care about the fact that the man who raised the whole thing, his brother wasn't sharing his inheritance with him? If you read through Luke's Gospel, you quickly realize that Jesus cares passionately about justice and injustice. And especially when injustice results in poverty and hunger and exploitation. Jesus cares passionately about these things. Listen again to what he says in Luke chapter 6. "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh." And then a few verses later, "Woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your comfort. Woe to you who are well fed now, for you will go hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you will mourn and weep." Clearly, Jesus is passionate about injustice. So today's passage is not about whether or not he's passionate about injustice. That already we know. Today's passage is about something different. And that brings us to the other questions that we thought it raised. Is it wrong for us to have savings? How do we balance our need for personal security with the needs of others? Really, really difficult questions. But I think the clue to the answer lies in the fact that the man already had barns to store his grain in. What he wanted to do was build bigger barns. And then he thought he could take life easy. And he could eat and drink and be merry. There's nothing wrong with having savings. Nothing wrong with having savings at all. In fact, it's a very wise thing to have. Particularly if you're approaching retirement. The problem comes when your savings are far, far, far more than you could ever possibly need. That's when being prudent sort of shifts into being greedy and self-centered. And it points to a much bigger issue to do with our faith itself and who we are putting our trust in. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus is very clear in his teaching about money and possessions. Listen to these words from the Sermon on the Mount. No one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. You just cannot do it. You cannot serve both. Either you believe that money is the answer to all your problems, that money can buy you health and love and happiness, or you believe that the source of all these things is a loving, faithful God. And the God who is generous and who gives us all we need. You can't do both. You can either put your trust in money or you can put your trust in God. You can't do both. Back in 2005, we had a series of 3 guest services, and they were on modern day idols. So these were the idols that people tended to have here in Scotland in 2005. And I don't think they're all that different these days. They were the idols of money, sex, and power. And we had great fun exploring them over a course of 3 months. And I remember in my talk on money, I spoke of the false god of materialism. You know, we live in a world that runs on this ideology of materialism. Whole advertising companies base their income on it. The whole system depends on it. That we buy and we buy and we buy, and that there is economic growth. How often do you hear the phrase economic growth mentioned, especially towards the end of the tax year? So that's the world we're living in. But here are 4 things that the advertisers don't tell you when it comes to money and possessions. Firstly, that the more you have, the more you have to do to protect it. And that means bigger burglar alarms. Okay? It means investing in security systems and cameras that you can watch on your iPhone to make sure no one's breaking into your house while you're away. It means having another look at your insurance policies. Have you got your premiums high enough to cover all the stuff in your garage? The more you have, the more you have to do to protect it. Secondly, the more you have, the more dependent on it you become. Because you never have enough. Someone once asked a famous American industrialist how much money he needed in life. This was someone who's probably among the richest individuals in the world. And his answer was, just a little bit more than I have just now. You never have enough. It's like an addiction that you can't get free of. The more you have, the more you need it. Thirdly, the third thing we don't get told by the advertisers, the better off we become, the less we seem to see each other. Because there's no need to pop round to your neighbours to borrow the hedge trimmer anymore. Because you've got a much better hedge trimmer. And I hope they don't come asking you to borrow it. They can buy their own. I remember a few years back, a friend of ours who was a GP told the story of one of her secretaries in her practice who had won a 6-figure sum on the pools. Wow! All that money. Problem solved. Time to sit back and eat and drink and be merry. At least that's the dream that was sold her. What did she find out? She found out that as soon as the word gets out, the begging emails started to come in. And not just from members of her own family and her extended family, but people she knew at school, people she hardly knew at all. Everybody needs money, especially to someone who's just won it on the pools. Turns out it started to affect her friendships with people, because when people were nice to her, she began to suspect that they were being nice to her because they wanted her to give them some of her money. So she didn't know who to trust in the end. She started getting hate mail. You got all that money, why aren't you sharing some of it? And she ended up having to move house. So she lost the house that she lived in. Well, maybe she got a better one, I don't know, but she had left behind all her friends. She had left behind all her community. The better off we become, the less we seem to see each other. And the fourth thing, and this is probably the most important, our possessions can so easily get between us and God. As Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart lies. If your treasure is on earth, that's where your heart's going to be. Far better to store treasures in heaven. So how do we avoid all of this? Well, can I give you some good news? Okay? The way to avoid the pitfalls and the snares of materialism. There's nothing wrong with luxury. Okay? You can still get those nice Christmas presents that you always wanted. There's nothing wrong with a nice holiday. There's nothing wrong with having a good meal out. There's nothing wrong with any of these things. That's not the answer to the scourge of materialism. The answer is not to stop using money. Money's useful. The answer is not to give away all that you possess, because then someone's going to have to look after you. It's actually much more simple than that. The answer is this: don't put your trust in things that won't last. Rather, put your trust in the things that do last. And there's nothing that will last more than the love of a Heavenly Father, a love that has been made known to us in Jesus Christ, His Son. His love for us is more than we could ever possibly imagine, and He knows our needs, and He longs to meet them. So that's the answer: to put our trust in things that last, things that are reliable, and to live every day knowing that everything we have, and everything we own, and everything we earn is not ours by right. It's not because we deserve it. It's God's gift to us. And it's when we start thinking like that about our possessions, that they're God's gift to us, that we discover it's much more easy to be generous with them, because they don't belong to us in the first place. And this applies to us as a church as much as it does to us individuals. We don't want people in 20 years' time looking back and saying, they had all that money, why didn't they use it? Why did they build bigger barns to store it in? All that we possess is simply God's gift to us. And ultimately, we need to use these things in a way that glorifies God and demonstrates who we put our trust in. So let's just take a few moments now to pause and to reflect. What have we learned today about Jesus' story of the man who wanted to build bigger barns? Loving God, we thank you for the voice of little children who help us keep everything in perspective, the things that really matter in life. And we thank you too that everything we have because you've given it to us. So please help us to offer our lives back to you, living sacrifices to be used for your glory. We ask this for Jesus' sake. Amen.